Welcome back. Hello friend, about 95% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you also don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe or leave your comment. I've been going to this old cabin for as long as I can remember. I started when I was a young man, but now at 65, it's where I spend most of my days, trying to enjoy the peace and quiet of the woods. There's nothing fancy, just a simple place I fixed up over the years. No electricity, no running water, just the basics. It's all I need after a lifetime of noise and mess. This trip started off just like all the others. I brought in enough firewood, made sure the stove was working, and got settled in. The first couple of days were peaceful, but something felt off this time. The air felt different, maybe it was the weather. Dark clouds had been hanging low since I got here, and the wind had a bite to it that didn't seem right for this time of year. I told myself it was probably just me getting old, making things seem worse than they were. On the third day, I went for a walk to the stream nearby. It's not far, just a short walk through the woods. The sound of the water always helped me relax. But when I got closer, something wasn't right. The path I always took had changed. It was overgrown, like nobody had walked through in years. I felt uneasy but kept moving. I figured it was just the woods taking back what belonged to them. When I finally got to the stream, the water wasn't like it usually was. It was dirty, not clear like I remembered. I crouched down to touch it but pulled my hand back quickly. The water was freezing cold, way colder than it should be. I didn't hang around. Something about it didn't feel right, so I headed back to the cabin. That night, the wind picked up hard. The trees outside were creaking and groaning, making the whole cabin feel like it was alive. I sat by the fire, staring at the flames, but I couldn't shake the feeling I had since I went to the stream. As I sat there, I started hearing something outside. It wasn't the usual sound of animals or the wind. It was footsteps, slow and steady, crunching on the dead leaves. I tried to tell myself it was just some animal, but I knew it wasn't. The footsteps were too heavy, too planned. I grabbed the flashlight I always kept by the door and pointed it out the window. All I saw were trees swaying in the wind. Nothing moved on the ground, but I could still hear the footsteps. They were going around the cabin, getting closer each time. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. I wasn't a kid anymore. I knew better than to let fear take over. The footsteps stopped. Everything went quiet. I stood there, frozen, listening for any sound. That's when I heard it. A soft scraping, like something was dragging across the cabin's walls. It moved slowly, almost like it was feeling its way around. My skin prickled. I turned off the flashlight, thinking maybe if I stayed in the dark, whatever it was would leave me alone. But the scraping didn't stop, kept going closer and closer to the front door. I stood still, barely breathing, hoping it would pass by. But then, the sound stopped right outside the front door. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stared at the door, waiting for something to happen. Then, out of nowhere, a single, loud knock echoed through the cabin. It wasn't a person knocking. It didn't feel like that. Whatever was out there, it knew I was inside. I stood there, waiting for it to knock again, but it didn't. Instead, the footsteps started again, moving away, getting quieter and quieter until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep that night. As soon as the first light came through the trees, I packed up what I could and left the cabin. I didn't even care about the rest of my stuff. I never went back, and I never figured out what was out there that night. But I know one thing for sure. It wasn't a person, and it wasn't any animal I'd ever heard. It was something else, something that didn't belong in those woods. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it. And even though I've tried to forget, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for me to come back. Sometimes late at night, when the wind picks up just right, I can almost hear it. Those same slow footsteps, getting closer, like they're searching for me again. I used to run with a group. It wasn't something I could just walk away from. The money kept me in, and there weren't many other options. We did all kinds of jobs, from break-ins to drug deals. But this one was different. One of our guys vanished. He was working a deal with some shady people and never came back. Word was he was hiding out in a cabin deep in the woods, trying to lay low from the cops, or maybe from us. Either way, the boss wanted him found. A few of us packed up and headed out to the forest. I didn't like it, walking into unknown territory like that, but I had to go. Backing out wasn't an option. The plan seemed simple: go in, find him, bring him back. But things never go as planned in this life, especially not in situations like this. We parked near the edge of the woods and started walking. The forest was nothing like the city. All you could hear was the wind rustling through the leaves and the occasional crunch of a twig under our feet. It was quiet, too quiet. Every step felt louder than it should, even though the ground was soft with fallen pine needles. We had to move carefully. The police had been searching the area, and if they spotted us, we were done. After about an hour, we finally spotted the cabin. It looked old and run down, like no one had lived there in years. The windows were broken, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. It didn't seem like anyone was inside, but we had a job to do, so we moved in closer, keeping low. The door creaked as it opened. Inside, it was even worse than it looked from the outside. Dust covered everything, and the floor creaked with every step. There were signs that someone had been staying there. Footprints, an empty can of food, but the place was empty now. We split up to search the whole cabin. I went to check the back while the others looked around the front. That's when I found something strange. In the back room, there was a pile of torn, dirty clothes, like someone had been living there but left in a hurry. Next to it was a map, hastily drawn, showing paths through the forest. At the bottom, scrawled in shaky handwriting, was the word police. Whoever had been there knew the cops were closing in. I stepped out of the room to call the others when I heard a noise outside. It was faint, just a rustling, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I signaled to the others and we slipped out of the cabin, trying to stay quiet. We crouched behind a fallen tree, listening. The noise came again, closer this time. Through the trees, we saw them, cops, moving in on the cabin. We had no choice but to run. We bolted through the woods, doing our best to stay hidden, but it was no use. The police were everywhere, cutting off every escape. My heart was racing, and my legs were burning, but I kept going. I knew if they caught us, it would be over. Somehow, I got separated from the others. I didn't know where they went, and I didn't have time to look. I just kept running deeper into the woods. The trees grew thicker, and the light faded as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sounds of footsteps behind me got quieter, but I knew the cops were still out there, searching. Eventually, I stumbled across another cabin, smaller than the first and hidden behind a cluster of trees. It looked abandoned, but I didn't care. I needed to hide. I pushed the door open and slipped inside, crouching near the window to watch for any signs of the police. I don't know how long I stayed there, but it felt like hours. My mind raced, thinking of what would happen next. The gang wouldn't be happy if I didn't bring the guy back, but there was no way I was going back to that first cabin. The cops were all over it. Then I remembered the map. It didn't just show random paths, it marked a way out. The guy we were looking for must have planned to use it to escape, knowing both we and the cops would be closing in. I pulled the map from my pocket, tracing the route with my finger. It was risky, but it was my only chance. I waited until it was fully dark, then slipped out of the cabin. The forest was quiet, but I moved fast, following the path on the map. Every little sound made my heart race. Every shadow seemed to move. But after what felt like forever, I saw it, the road. It was just ahead, through a thick line of trees. I thought I was free, but then I heard a snap behind me, like a branch breaking. I froze. Slowly, I turned around, my heart thudding in my chest. Standing just beyond the tree line was a figure. I couldn't see the face in the darkness, but I knew it wasn't the cops. This wasn't some random person passing through the woods. The reality hit me hard. It was him, the guy we were looking for. He'd been watching me the whole time. Before I could react, he disappeared into the shadows, vanishing like smoke. And that's when I realized it wasn't just the police hunting us. He was hunting us too. I ran, but it didn't matter. The forest was endless, the trees thick, and I was alone. Every sound echoed, growing louder, until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The footsteps were back, closer, faster, and I knew, deep down, that I wasn't going to make it out. I glanced at the map one last time before crumpling it in my fist. The paths didn't matter now. There was no way out, not for me. I had been the prey all along. I rented a small cabin in the mountains for the weekend to get away. It was deep in the woods, far from anyone, and it was so quiet out there. Exactly what I needed. The weather report said it would rain most of the time, but I didn't care. I brought a few books, and the idea of sitting by the window while the rain fell on the roof sounded perfect. The drive up wasn't great, though. The road was narrow and twisted around steep hills. As I went higher, the rain got heavier. By the time I reached the cabin, it was pouring hard. I parked the car and ran inside as fast as I could. The cabin was simple: a small living room, a kitchen, and a bedroom. There was a fireplace, but I didn't feel like starting a fire yet. I unpacked and made myself a cup of coffee. The rain didn't stop. I looked out the window, watching the trees sway in the wind. Thick fog started creeping through the forest, covering everything until I could barely see a few feet past the porch. The place felt lonely, like it was cut off from everything else. As night came, the rain got heavier. It pounded against the roof so hard it was the only thing I could hear. The fog was still thick outside, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been building since I arrived. I kept telling myself it was just because I was alone in a new place. That had to be it. Eventually, I decided to go to bed, hoping sleep would calm me down. I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart racing for no reason. The rain had slowed, but the cabin felt strange. I sat still, listening. There was nothing. The wind had stopped, and it was dead quiet. I tried to go back to sleep, but something felt wrong, and I couldn't put my finger on it. Then I heard it, a sound just outside. It wasn't the wind or the rain. It was soft, like someone walking slowly on the porch. At first, I thought I was just hearing things, but then it came again, slow, steady footsteps. My chest tightened, and my heart started pounding. I knew no one else was supposed to be out here. I stayed completely still, trying to tell myself it was probably just an animal or the wood creaking. But then I heard the front steps groan like someone was standing right outside the door. There was definitely something there. I sat up, my body tense, listening for any more sounds. The footsteps had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was just outside, waiting. I didn't move for a long time. I was too scared to even breathe. After what felt like forever, I forced myself out of bed and walked quietly to the window. The fog was still thick, and the rain had picked up again, lightly hitting the roof. I couldn't see anything past the porch. The rain made it hard to tell if anyone was there, but that didn't explain what I heard. I crawled back into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that nothing was out there, but I couldn't sleep. My eyes stayed wide open, listening for any sign of movement. Hours passed, and the rain got louder. I didn't hear the footsteps again, but I couldn't relax. When the sun finally started to rise, I got up and packed my stuff. There was no way I was spending another night there. As I loaded the car, I turned to look back at the cabin. The fog still hung low around the trees, and the ground was soaked. That's when I saw them. Footprints, deep and muddy, leading from the side of the cabin into the woods. They hadn't been there before. My stomach dropped. Those prints were fresh. I didn't stick around to find out where they went or who made them. I jumped in my car and drove as fast as I could down that narrow road, not looking back. But something about the prints stayed in my mind. They weren't just around the side of the cabin. They circled the whole place. Someone or something had been walking around the cabin all night, watching. As I drove, one thought kept creeping in, making my skin crawl. Whoever it was out there wasn't just walking around. They were waiting. My sister and I decided to take a trip to a cabin in the woods with my friend from the hostel. We just wanted a break from everything. A weekend to relax and get away from the stress. The cabin was far from town, surrounded by trees, and there was no phone service. It was exactly what we thought we needed. A quiet place with nothing to worry about. The first day was really nice. We walked through the forest, followed some trails, and even found a small stream nearby. The air felt fresh, and the only sounds were birds and the water moving. That night, we made a fire outside and sat around it, just enjoying the quiet. It was strange how silent it was out there. No cars, no people, just the wind sometimes making the trees move or maybe an animal passing by. We laughed about how alone we were out there, but honestly, it made me feel uneasy. The darkness out in the woods felt heavier, like it was pressing in. There was no light anywhere except for our small fire and the stars above. By the second night, things started to feel different. I didn't know why, but the air felt thick, like something was off. When we went to bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just animals moving around, but the sounds were too steady, too close. It sounded like footsteps on the ground, slowly moving around the cabin. Every time I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the sounds would start up again, only this time they were closer. I didn't want to scare anyone, so I stayed quiet, just listening. Then my friend from the hostel came into the room I was sharing with my sister. She looked worried. She didn't say anything but pointed toward the window. I knew right away she had heard it too. Someone or something was outside. We sat in the dark, listening to the footsteps going around the cabin. My heart was racing, and I tried to keep calm, but I couldn't. The footsteps would stop, then everything would go completely quiet. Just when I thought it was over, I heard something hit the side of the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. Then another thud, and another. It sounded like someone was throwing things at the walls, but I couldn't figure out why. This went on for hours. Footsteps, then something hitting the walls, then silence. None of us looked outside. We didn't want to know what was out there. Finally, the noises stopped completely. The rest of the night was silent, but none of us could sleep. In the morning, we found big rocks all around the cabin, too big to be thrown by any animal. Whatever had been out there had left them. But that wasn't the worst part. We found footprints, human footprints, coming from the woods, circling the cabin again and again, then heading back into the trees. We packed up fast and left. The cabin wasn't relaxing anymore. The whole drive back was quiet, none of us saying much. No matter how far we drove or how bright the day was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us that night. Not something passing by, something waiting. When we got home, I felt a little better, like maybe it was all just in my head. But when I checked my phone, I saw a message from a number I didn't know. Attached to it was a photo. It was a picture of the three of us, taken through the cabin window while we sat by the fire on the first night. I don't know who took that picture, but whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly where we were the whole time, and I have no idea what they wanted. I rented a cabin up north, deep in the woods. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend escape from the noise of city life. The cabin next to mine belonged to my neighbor, an army sergeant. I didn't know him well, just that he lived there with his wife, and they mostly kept to themselves. I arrived late Friday afternoon. The air was cool, and the wind rustled through the trees, making everything feel more isolated than I expected. The cabin was small but cozy. After unpacking, I decided to take a quick walk before it got too dark. As I walked along the narrow dirt path behind my cabin, I noticed how close their place was. It looked a lot like mine, but bigger, with a small garden that was neat and a few solar lights that glowed softly. Something about their cabin felt different. It wasn't just the size. It was the silence around it. No lights were on inside, and there were no signs of movement. The place felt empty. I tried not to think too much about it and continued my walk deeper into the woods. I spent some time exploring before heading back. The light was fading quickly, and I didn't want to get lost out there. As I got close to my cabin, I noticed something strange. A soft glow coming from their cabin now. I hadn't seen them arrive, and I didn't hear a car, but I wasn't really paying attention. The night passed without any problems, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw the sergeant standing in his yard, staring straight at me. His face was blank, and he didn't wave or acknowledge me, just stood there for a few minutes before turning and walking back inside. I figured he wasn't in the mood for conversation, so I went about my day. Later that evening, as the sun set, I heard strange noises coming from their cabin. It sounded like thuds and soft movements. I told myself it was nothing and tried to ignore it. But later, around midnight, something woke me up, a loud crash. I jumped up and looked outside. That's when I saw the sergeant standing on his porch, looking down at something. His wife wasn't with him. His fists were clenched, and there was a mess of broken wood near his feet. From my window, I couldn't see clearly, but I sensed something was wrong. I thought about going outside to check on them, but decided against it. I didn't know him well, and if he was in trouble, I wasn't sure how I could help. Still, the thought bothered me. The next morning, I didn't see either of them. Their car was still parked where it had been the day before, but the cabin felt deserted again. That uneasy feeling crept back. I went about my day, but as evening came, I saw something that confirmed my worst fears. From my porch, I noticed the sergeant's cabin door was open, swinging slowly in the wind. I had to find out what was happening. I walked over, my heart racing, and stood outside their door, listening. There were no sounds, no signs of life. I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The place was a mess. Furniture was overturned, and broken glass covered the floor, but there was no sign of either of them. Then I spotted something. A trail of dark stains leading from the living room toward the back door. I followed the trail outside, down the steps, and into the trees behind the cabin. It went deeper into the woods, fading as it went. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I felt exposed, like I wasn't supposed to be there, as if something was watching me. The trail led to a large, disturbed patch of dirt. It looked freshly dug, but there were no tools or shovels around. I stood there, staring at the ground, knowing what I was looking at but refusing to believe it. The realization hit me hard, sending chills down my spine. That night, I hurriedly packed my things and left early, driving away from the cabin without looking back. I never reported what I saw and didn't check the news later to see if anything came up. Part of me knew the truth but didn't want to be involved. Whatever had happened, it felt like it was over, but I could never shake the unease. Now, every time I pass that road, the memory rushes back. The woods, the cabin, and the chilling sense that something was still out there. Something dark and buried deep beneath the ground, waiting for its moment. I can't help but feel that the forest holds its secrets close, ready to claim anyone who dares to uncover them. The thought lingers, a whisper in the back of my mind, reminding me that some things are better left alone. It was a cold October afternoon when I got to the old cabin. My uncle had left it to me after he died, and I thought it was finally time to check it out. The cabin, built in 1978, sat alone in the woods, surrounded by tall pine trees. The worn wooden walls creaked as I pushed the door open, and the musty smell of old wood hit me as I stepped inside. Once inside, I noticed how dark it was, even with the afternoon light. Dust floated in the few rays that came through the dirty windows. I looked around at the old furniture, a shaky table, a few mismatched chairs, and a faded couch. It felt like stepping back in time, like I was in a museum from the late 70s. After I explored for a bit, I decided to take a walk in the woods. I grabbed a flashlight, just in case, and stepped out into the chilly air. The trees seemed to loom over me, and I could hear leaves crunching beneath my feet. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I stopped several times, looking around, but there was nothing there, just the soft rustle of the wind through the branches. Eventually, I found a small clearing that felt peaceful, so I sat on a fallen log and closed my eyes for a moment to take in the quiet. Suddenly, I heard a snap behind me, like a twig breaking. My heart raced. I turned slowly, but saw nothing, just trees. I tried to brush it off as nerves and decided to head back. On my way back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were marks on the ground, deep scratches leading away from the cabin toward the woods. They were too big to be from any animal I knew. A chill ran down my spine, and I hurried back to the cabin, my mind racing. Once inside, I locked the door and sat at the table, trying to calm my nerves. I decided to light a small fire in the fireplace, hoping it would warm the room and help me feel safe. As I stared into the flames, I caught sight of something moving outside the window, a figure darting quickly between the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart pounded even harder. I wanted to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. The beam moved over the trees, revealing nothing but shadows. Then I heard it again, a loud crash, like something heavy hitting the cabin. I jumped up, my heart racing. I pointed the flashlight toward the noise, and the light landed on something near the door. I held my breath. It looked like a large animal, maybe a bear. I knew I had to stay calm and think, but I realized I couldn't just sit there and wait. I needed to make sure I was safe. Quietly, I moved to the back window to peek outside. My instincts screamed that I had to get out of the cabin. I quickly grabbed my bag, stuffing my essentials inside, and took a deep breath. Just as I reached for the door, I saw something move outside again. This time it was closer. My gut told me it wasn't a bear. It looked like a person, hunched over and moving carefully. Panic hit me, but I forced myself to stay quiet and calm. I knew I had to escape without being seen. I opened the back door slowly, making sure it didn't creak. Once outside, I moved quietly toward the tree line. My heart raced, but I had to keep going. I darted into the trees, staying low and using the darkness to hide. I pushed through the woods, branches scratching at my arms and face. I didn't stop until I reached the dirt road about a mile from the cabin. Out of breath and shaking, I looked back. The cabin loomed in the distance, and I could see nothing else. It was eerily quiet, not even a sound from the woods. I made my way to my car, feeling the tension in my body slowly ease as I drove away. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. But there was nothing, just the dark road stretching out behind me. As I drove away from that old cabin, I realized I had escaped something that day, something I still couldn't explain. The woods were too quiet, too still. I knew I would never return to that place. Some places are better left alone, and that cabin was one of them. But as I drove, a thought struck me. What if whatever I felt watching me had followed me? What if it was still out there, waiting for me to return? I glanced nervously at the trees lining the road, half expecting to see a shadow lurking just beyond the reach of my headlights. I pushed the gas pedal down, eager to put distance between myself and that old cabin, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. As I reached the end of the road, I couldn't shake the thought that the woods had a secret, a dark, twisted secret that I had stumbled upon. And even though I was far away now, I couldn't help but feel that the cabin would always be there, waiting in the shadows, ready to draw someone else in. I had just settled into the old cabin deep in the woods, ready for a weekend of peace and quiet. The sun was starting to go down, casting long shadows through the trees. I was excited to escape the noise of the city and enjoy nature, so I began making a fire outside to cook my dinner. As the fire crackled, I noticed something strange at the edge of the clearing. A big figure stood between the trees. It was too dark to see clearly, but it looked like a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weird stance. I shook my head, thinking it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone in a cabin surrounded by thick woods. As night fell, I went inside, locking the door behind me. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire and the little comfort of my surroundings. Just as I began to relax, I heard a loud thump against the cabin wall, making my heart race. It sounded like something, or someone was outside. I grabbed a flashlight and peeked through the window. The figure was closer now, standing just outside the glow of my fire. I could see more clearly. He had a scruffy beard, messy hair, and a dirty flannel shirt. Panic surged through me as I realized this wasn't a neighbor or another camper. This man looked rough and dangerous. I quickly backed away from the window and locked it tight. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. Should I call for help? There was no cell service out here. I grabbed my phone, hoping to get a signal, but there was nothing. I was truly alone. The thumping continued, getting louder as he moved around the cabin. I could hear him mumbling to himself, but I couldn't make out the words. I wanted to believe he was just lost, but something deep inside told me otherwise. My heart thudded in my chest as I listened, frozen in fear. Suddenly, the noise stopped. I held my breath, waiting for what would come next. Minutes felt like hours. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against wood. He was trying to pry the door open. Adrenaline rushed through me, and I knew I had to act fast. I glanced around the cabin and spotted a heavy log that had been used as a doorstop. I grabbed it, ready to defend myself. If he got in, I had to be ready. The door rattled violently, and I could see the knob twisting. My heart raced as I heard his heavy breathing. The door creaked under the pressure, but it held strong. In that moment, I remembered the kitchen knife on the table. I had to make a choice. Would I wait and hope he gave up, or would I confront him if he broke in? Just then, the door splintered. I gripped the log tightly and moved to the side, ready to swing. The door swung open, and the man stepped inside, eyes wild and desperate. I swung the log with all my strength, hitting him hard across the shoulder. He stumbled back, caught off guard. Without wasting a second, I dashed past him, bolting out of the cabin and into the woods. I ran blindly through the trees, branches scratching at my arms and face. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. I followed the rough path back to the road, pushing through the underbrush until I finally saw headlights in the distance. I ran until I reached my car, jumped inside, and locked the doors. I didn't look back as I drove away, my heart still pounding. I was shaken, but I was alive. As I drove away, I felt the weight of fear settle in my stomach. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. The thought sent chills down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that he might have followed me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next chance to strike. That night, I realized how dangerous it can be to be alone in the woods. As I got home, I told myself I would never return to that cabin. The woods might seem peaceful, but they hide terrible secrets. I could still hear his voice in my mind, the way he muttered softly to himself, full of anger and madness. It was a sound that would haunt me for a long time. Every time I close my eyes, I see that figure standing in the trees, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away. The feeling of being watched never left me. I knew that even in the safety of my own home, he could still be out there, waiting. And somewhere in those woods, the old cabin stood silent, holding on to the darkness that had come so close to swallowing me whole.